Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Rome, a city of marble temples, grand palaces, busy markets, and powerful families whose names were known across the empire. From the outside, Rome looked like a world of order and greatness, a civilization built on discipline, honor, and tradition. But behind the enormous doors of Roman villas, behind the quiet halls of imperial palaces, and away from the eyes of the public, was another world. A world of secrets, a world where love, ambition, and power often became impossible to separate, because in ancient Rome, a relationship was never just a relationship. A marriage could create alliances, a rumor could destroy a reputation, and a secret meeting could change the future of powerful people. Tonight, we are stepping into this hidden side of Roman history, not the battles, not the armies, not the famous emperors standing in statues, but the private moments that happened when nobody was watching. We will explore the stories of powerful Romans who lived surrounded by wealth and influence, yet still found themselves caught in complicated relationships, dangerous rumors, and unforgettable scandals. Some affairs were whispered about in quiet corners, some became political disasters, and some were remembered for thousands of years. But behind every story was a human being, someone searching for love, attention, security, or power in a world where every action could have consequences. So tonight, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and allow yourself to travel back nearly 2,000 years. Walk through the candlelit rooms of Roman villas, listen to the quiet conversations of aristocrats, enter the hidden corners of an empire where appearances mattered, and secrets could be more powerful than armies, because tonight, we are uncovering the secret affairs that shook ancient Rome. As darkness settled over the city, Rome transformed. The noisy markets slowly became quiet, the sounds of merchants faded into the distance, oil lamps flickered behind windows, servants closed heavy wooden doors, and in elegant homes scattered across the hills, another life quietly began. Ancient Rome was a society that admired dignity above almost everything else. Respectability mattered, honor mattered, family names mattered. Or at least, that was the image people wished to show. Yet human beings have always carried hidden desires, and beneath carefully arranged appearances, people often lived far more complicated lives. A senator might spend the day speaking proudly about morality, while privately worrying about rumors spreading among friends. A wealthy matron could host splendid banquets, while secretly exchanging messages that nobody else was meant to read. Even emperors, men who ruled millions, found themselves vulnerable to emotions that power alone could never control. Inside luxurious villas, conversations were rarely simple. A smile might contain hidden intentions, a marriage could conceal rivalry. An invitation to dinner might carry consequences. No guest expected, servants noticed things, neighbors whispered, friends became rivals, and secrets moved through Roman society like quiet shadows. Most people never wrote openly about these matters. Yet traces remained, fragments hidden inside letters, poems, court records, and the writings of historians who sometimes disapproved, and sometimes seemed strangely fascinated. Through those surviving pieces, a different Rome slowly appears, not a city carved from marble, but a city filled with ordinary fears and extraordinary ambitions. People longed for affection, they worried about betrayal, they hoped to secure their futures, and sometimes they risked everything. As moonlight touched the tiled roofs of the capital, carriages rolled softly through narrow streets, curtains remained closed, torches burned low, and somewhere, behind walls decorated with painted gardens and golden lamps, stories were unfolding that would echo far beyond their own time. Stories few people truly understood, stories hidden beneath layers of respectability, stories that reveal something timeless about human nature. And before we can enter those secret chambers, before we meet the families whose private lives became entangled with power, we must first understand why Roman society itself became such fertile ground for secrets, because beneath the greatness of the empire, silence often protected far more than truth. As the moon drifted above the sleeping city, and the last sounds of evening slowly disappeared into the distance, Rome seemed peaceful. From the outside, everything appeared ordered, the lamps burned softly, the fountains continued their endless songs, and behind thick walls of marble and stone, families settled into the quiet rhythms of the night. But appearances, as many Romans understood, could be wonderfully deceptive. Because beneath the polished image that the empire proudly displayed, an invisible world existed, a world built not upon laws and monuments, but upon expectations. Ancient Rome was a place where almost every person lived under the watchful eyes of others. Neighbors observed neighbors, servants listened carefully, clients reported news to patrons, and entire families carried reputations that had been carefully guarded for generations. Honor was not simply a personal matter, it belonged to the whole household. One careless mistake, one embarrassing rumor, could stain a family name that ancestors had spent centuries building, and so, many Romans became experts in silence. Children learned early that certain subjects were never discussed openly, wives protected their households from gossip, husbands guarded political ambitions with great care, even close friends sometimes hid their true thoughts behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. Because trust, like fine glass, could break far more easily than it could be repaired, in wealthy circles especially, life often resembled a delicate performance. Publicly, everyone played their assigned roles: respectable husbands, faithful wives, loyal friends, honorable senators. But private emotions rarely followed such neat arrangements. Love could become inconvenient, jealousy could appear without warning, and ambitions often collided with desires that nobody dared speak aloud. The Romans themselves understood this contradiction. Their poets wrote quietly of forbidden feelings, their playwrights amused audiences with stories of deception and hidden romance, and their historians, though often eager to judge others, filled pages with whispered accusations and mysterious scandals. Perhaps because they knew something timeless: human beings have always struggled between what society expects and what the heart secretly desires. Yet Rome added another layer to this struggle: status. Everything in Roman life seemed connected to rank. Who you married mattered, who your parents were mattered, whom you invited into your home mattered. Even friendships could influence fortunes. A single relationship might open doors to wealth or quietly close them forever. Because of this, many connections existed in the shadows. Messages were delivered discreetly, meetings were arranged carefully. And entire networks of favors and loyalties operated behind scenes invisible to most people. Oddly enough, servants often knew more than their masters imagined. A maid adjusting curtains might overhear delicate conversations. A household secretary copying letters might glimpse secrets never intended for his eyes. A trusted slave carrying messages across the city became an unwilling witness to stories that history itself would only partly remember. Meanwhile, Rome never truly slept. Long after darkness covered the streets, banquets continued, private gatherings lingered, poets recited verses. Wine cups were refilled, and among laughter and music, words were exchanged that could alter reputations by sunrise. Not all secrets involved romance. Some concerned money, others involved alliances. Some were born from fear, and some from loneliness, because despite the grandeur surrounding them, many Romans experienced the same worries familiar to people everywhere: the desire to belong, the fear of rejection, the longing to be admired, the quiet hope that someone might understand them. These emotions moved silently beneath layers of ceremony and tradition, and sometimes they produced consequences nobody could foresee. Over the centuries, countless secrets vanished without leaving a trace. But a few escaped the darkness. Whispers became rumors, rumors became stories, and stories, carried by historians and poets, survived long after the voices themselves had faded. Yet before those scandals emerged, before names became legends and private lives became public fascination, another force shaped everything within Roman society: the family, because in ancient Rome, love and duty rarely traveled separate paths. And nowhere was that truth more deeply felt than inside the homes of Rome itself. As dawn slowly approached the city, and pale light touched the rooftops of Rome, another day quietly awakened inside the grand homes of the empire. Servants moved through corridors with practiced silence, water splashed softly in marble basins, oil lamps faded as sunlight crept into painted rooms, and behind doors decorated with scenes of gardens and distant landscapes, families began their daily routines. To an outsider, these households might have appeared peaceful, but beneath the calm surface, countless hopes, expectations, and private emotions lived side by side, because in ancient Rome, the family stood at the center of nearly everything: a person's future, their reputation, their wealth, and even their political influence often depended upon the household into which they were born. Marriage, therefore, carried a meaning far greater than romance. For many Romans, it was a bridge between powerful families, an agreement carefully arranged long before love had the chance to speak. Parents discussed fortunes, names were considered, connections were weighed with great seriousness, and sometimes, young men and women discovered that their lives had already been planned by others. Yet human emotions rarely obeyed arrangements, and behind the ceremonies and celebrations, real people lived. Young brides left familiar homes and entered strange ones. Husbands carried responsibilities that stretched beyond affection, mothers worried over children and family honor, and fathers guarded their households with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Some marriages became genuine partnerships. Letters surviving from antiquity reveal moments of tenderness, shared grief, quiet devotion, and affection that endured through many years. Not every Roman union was cold or calculated. Far from it, some couples laughed together, raised children with care, and found comfort in one another despite the pressures surrounding them. But other marriages resembled fragile alliances. Behind polite appearances, resentments quietly grew, ambitions clashed, loneliness settled into rooms filled with luxury, and misunderstandings deepened in silence. Divorce itself was not uncommon among wealthy Romans. Though it often brought embarrassment, it remained surprisingly accepted. Relationships could end, new alliances could be formed, and fortunes might rise or fall with every change. Even wedding ceremonies reflected the importance of tradition. Torches illuminated evening processions. Songs echoed through the streets, friends gathered to celebrate, and symbolic rituals reminded everyone that marriage united not merely two individuals, but entire families. Yet beneath the joyful sounds, uncertainties often lingered. Would affection grow? Would trust survive? Would ambitions remain compatible? No one truly knew. Inside aristocratic households, daily life unfolded with remarkable complexity. Children played beneath painted ceilings, teachers instructed young minds, servants prepared meals and managed endless tasks, grandparents shared stories from earlier generations, and all the while, small tensions sometimes passed unnoticed: a careless remark, an unexpected friendship, a lingering glance, simple moments that seemed harmless at first, yet possessed the quiet power to change lives. Because the Romans understood something many people still recognize today: families are not merely collections of names, they are worlds unto themselves, filled with loyalties, expectations, secrets, and emotions too complicated to fit neatly into rules. Perhaps this was why poets often wrote about love with both joy and sadness, because affection brought comfort, but also vulnerability. To care deeply for another person was to place a piece of oneself into uncertain hands, and uncertainty, even in times of peace, could feel frightening, especially among the elite, for powerful families lived under constant observation. Visitors came and went, servants noticed details, friends shared news, and rumors could travel more swiftly than horses. Maintaining harmony became almost an art, an image carefully preserved for society, but images, however beautiful, sometimes concealed hidden cracks. As the morning sun climbed higher above Rome, wives supervised households, husbands attended business and politics, and children prepared for futures already shaped by family expectations. Everything appeared orderly, everything appeared secure. Yet beyond these walls, temptations existed, unexpected encounters waited, and emotions, those quiet companions of every age, often refused to remain obedient, because before long, love itself would become something far more dangerous, not merely a private matter between hearts, but a weapon capable of influencing power. And within the world of Rome, few forces proved more unpredictable than that. As the warmth of morning slowly settled over the hills of Rome, and sunlight danced across quiet fountains and polished marble floors, life inside the villas of the aristocracy unfolded with a rhythm that seemed almost untouched by the troubles of ordinary people. From the streets below, these homes appeared magnificent. Tall columns framed elegant courtyards, gardens bloomed with roses and laurel trees, statues stood motionless beside reflecting pools. And behind painted walls, families whose names were spoken across the empire enjoyed lives surrounded by remarkable comfort. At least, that was how it appeared, because luxury, like reputation, often revealed only part of the story. Within these grand residences, daily life moved at a slower pace. Servants opened curtains to welcome the day. Fresh bread and fruit were arranged carefully upon polished tables. Gentle sounds of flowing water echoed through shaded courtyards, and wealthy Romans discussed politics, poetry, and philosophy while reclining in peaceful surroundings. Yet even among such beauty, human worries remained close companions. For aristocrats lived in a world built upon appearances. Everything had meaning: the colors of one's clothing, the guests invited to dinner, the quality of decorations, even the smallest details reflected status, and so, many families devoted enormous energy to maintaining an image of harmony and success. But behind closed doors, life could be surprisingly fragile. Some noble husbands spent long periods away from home, occupied with business or political ambitions. Their wives oversaw large households filled with servants, tutors, and children. Days passed quietly, yet loneliness often settled into rooms decorated with gold and marble. Letters became treasured possessions, unexpected visitors brought excitement, and simple conversation sometimes carried more importance than anyone realized. In these circles, friendship itself could become wonderfully complicated. A trusted companion might also be a rival, a neighbor might secretly envy another family's fortune, and beneath graceful smiles, ambitions quietly flourished. Banquets offered opportunities for more than entertainment. Guests exchanged news, alliances were strengthened, whispers traveled softly beneath the music, and every invitation held meaning. Those seated closest to the host enjoyed subtle privileges, those absent were noticed. Nothing escaped attention for long. Women of aristocratic families occupied particularly fascinating roles. Though Roman society remained largely controlled by men, wealthy women often exercised influence in quieter ways. They managed estates, supervised servants, arranged marriages, maintained family connections, and through intelligence and charm, some guided decisions without ever appearing to do so. their world was one of conversations rather than commands. Subtlety rather than spectacle, but influence. Nonetheless, meanwhile, young members of these households grew up surrounded by expectations. Sons prepared for careers worthy of their ancestors, daughters learned the responsibilities of managing future homes. Teachers instructed them in literature, manners, and traditions. Yet beneath such careful education, dreams remained deeply personal. Not every son wished for public office, not every daughter welcomed arranged marriages, and hidden desires often remained known only to themselves. Perhaps this was why private gardens became beloved places. Away from formal gatherings and demanding responsibilities, individuals could breathe. They strolled beneath shaded trees, read poetry beside fountains, or sat quietly while birds sang among flowering plants. Moments of peace, small islands of solitude within lives constantly observed, yet complete privacy rarely existed. Servants moved silently through every room. Visitors arrived unexpectedly. Friends shared information, and gossip drifted through society with astonishing speed. A careless glance, an innocent meeting, a misunderstood conversation. Such things could become stories before sunset, and stories, once released, were difficult to reclaim. Still, despite these pressures, many aristocrats genuinely sought happiness. They collected books, supported artists, listened to musicians, hosted elegant gatherings, and searched, like people everywhere, for companionship and understanding. Because wealth could purchase comfort, but not contentment. It could fill homes with beauty, yet leave hearts strangely restless, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the city. Carriages rolled toward villas preparing for evening guests, servants lit oil lamps, wine was cooled, musicians tuned their instruments, and behind welcoming smiles, new conversations awaited, conversations capable of creating friendships, rivalries, and something far more dangerous, for among Rome's elite, romance itself was beginning to intertwine with ambition, and before long, affection would no longer remain merely personal. It would become something capable of influencing the balance of power itself. As evening settled gently across the city and golden light faded behind the distant hills, Rome prepared itself for another night. Oil lamps flickered to life one by one, musicians filled elegant dining rooms with soft melodies, the scent of wine and roasted herbs drifted through open courtyards, and within the homes of the wealthy, carefully planned gatherings quietly began. These occasions appeared graceful, almost peaceful. Friends exchanged compliments, poets recited verses, laughter rose and disappeared like a passing breeze. But beneath the pleasant conversations, another game was often being played, a game far quieter than war, yet sometimes far more dangerous. Because in ancient Rome, romance could become a form of influence, and influence, when combined with ambition, could reshape destinies. Powerful families understood that emotions possessed tremendous value. Affection could strengthen alliances, marriage could secure loyalty, and personal relationships sometimes achieved what speeches and laws could not. For this reason, love rarely existed entirely separate from politics. The two worlds often overlapped in ways both subtle and unexpected. A charming young nobleman might find himself admired not only for his appearance, but for the opportunities his name represented. A wealthy widow attracted attention beyond simple companionship. Her fortune, her connections, and her influence made her presence highly desirable. Even friendships between families could carry hidden calculations. People rarely spoke openly about such matters. Instead, they smiled. They exchanged gifts, they attended banquets, and they allowed affection and ambition to quietly intertwine. Sometimes genuine feelings blossomed, sometimes they did not, and occasionally, the difference became impossible to distinguish. Among the aristocracy, introductions were rarely accidental. mothers observed potential matches, fathers considered advantages, friends offered recommendations. And every encounter seemed wrapped in invisible expectations, yet human hearts remained wonderfully unpredictable. People fell in love with unsuitable partners, they became attached to individuals who complicated carefully arranged plans, and emotions ignored social strategies with remarkable indifference. This unpredictability frightened many families, because love, unlike wealth or titles, could not always be controlled. Poets often captured this truth. Their verses spoke of longing, of sleepless nights, of jealousy and uncertainty, and though generations have passed, their words still feel strangely familiar, because beneath Roman clothing and ancient customs, these people experienced emotions recognizable to anyone. They hoped, they worried, they dreamed, and sometimes they made choices that surprised even themselves. Yet in Rome, private emotions carried public consequences. An unexpected romance might offend powerful relatives. A marriage could unite rival families. A separation might damage reputations. And whispers surrounding personal relationships could influence political careers. People paid attention, always, not because they were unusually cruel, but because every connection held meaning. Influence flowed through families like rivers through valleys, changing direction, creating opportunities, and occasionally causing destruction. Letters became especially important in such a world. Carefully written messages traveled across the city. Words chosen with elegance concealed deeper meanings, expressions of affection mixed with discussions of loyalty and obligation. And sometimes, a single sentence carried implications understood only by its recipient. Meanwhile, banquets continued to provide fertile ground for quiet maneuvering. Guests reclined comfortably beneath painted ceilings, servants moved gracefully among them, musicians played gentle melodies, and hidden beneath ordinary conversation, alliances slowly formed. Not all were sinister, many friendships proved sincere. Many marriages brought happiness, but ambition remained ever present, like a shadow following the sunlight. Invisible at times, yet impossible to escape, as the stars appeared above Rome, and laughter echoed softly from distant villas. Few could predict which relationships would remain harmless, and which might someday become dangerous, because emotions possess extraordinary power. And nowhere was that power more clearly revealed than among those who lived closest to authority. Soon, those quiet influences would reach the imperial palaces themselves, places of unimaginable wealth, places of endless ceremony, places where trust was fragile, and secrets multiplied behind marble walls, and within those magnificent residences, an entirely different world awaited. A world hidden behind curtains and guarded entrances, a world few ordinary Romans would ever see, the secret world inside Roman palaces. As darkness wrapped itself around the city, and the sounds of ordinary life slowly faded into the night, another world remained awake. High above the crowded streets, upon the Palatine Hill, the imperial palaces stood quietly beneath the stars. Their marble walls gleamed softly in the moonlight, torches burned beside guarded entrances, fountains whispered endlessly in secluded courtyards, and behind those magnificent walls, life followed rhythms very different from those known by most Romans. To ordinary citizens, the palace seemed almost mysterious, a place of unimaginable luxury, a place where emperors ruled over distant provinces and commanded vast armies. But few outsiders understood what daily life inside those halls truly looked like, for beyond the splendor, the palace was also a world of endless routines. Before sunrise, servants moved through silent corridors carrying lamps and fresh water. Cooks prepared meals in bustling kitchens hidden from view. Messengers arrived with letters from every corner of the empire. Secretaries organized scrolls and documents, and chamberlains quietly managed the countless details required to sustain imperial life, everything appeared orderly, almost timeless, yet beneath that calm surface, countless stories unfolded. The palace itself resembled a small city, hundreds of people lived within its walls. Servants, guards, advisors, freedmen, musicians, physicians, teachers, and members of the imperial family, each person carried ambitions, fears, and loyalties of their own, and where so many lives intertwined, secrets naturally flourished. Privacy, strangely enough, became difficult to find. Walls had ears. Servants noticed details, guards overheard conversations, and rumors traveled quietly through corridors long before reaching the streets outside. Sometimes, those whispers contained little truth, other times, they revealed far more than anyone intended. Within the private apartments of the palace, life could feel surprisingly ordinary. Children played games beneath painted ceilings, family members shared meals, poets entertained small gatherings. Musicians filled rooms with soft melodies, and evening conversations unfolded beside flickering oil lamps. Despite the enormous power surrounding them, those who lived there still experienced loneliness, still worried, still hoped, still sought affection and understanding. Power itself could not protect against such feelings. In fact, it often complicated them, because trust became precious inside the palace. Every friendship carried uncertainty, every compliment invited suspicion, every new arrival raised questions. Who could truly be trusted, who served faithfully, and who merely smiled while pursuing hidden ambitions? Such uncertainties created an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in Rome. People learned to speak carefully, to reveal little, to observe much. Even simple gestures acquired meaning: a delayed invitation, a private conversation, an unexpected visitor. Small details sometimes inspired endless speculation. And speculation, within the palace, could prove remarkably powerful. Interestingly, many of the most influential individuals held no official titles at all. Trusted servants enjoyed access others could only dream about. Freedmen organized sensitive affairs, personal attendants became companions and confidants, and women of the imperial household exercised quiet influence through relationships built upon years of trust. The grand machinery of empire often depended upon conversations invisible to history, conversations held in gardens, in libraries, in shaded courtyards where fountains softened every sound, moments that seemed insignificant, yet quietly shaped the lives of millions. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Rome imagined endless wonders. Citizens whispered stories of unimaginable luxury, exotic animals, golden chambers, magnificent feasts, and although some tales contained grains of truth, others grew larger with every retelling. Because mystery itself possesses a peculiar charm, people have always been fascinated by places they cannot enter, and nowhere inspired more curiosity than the residence of the emperor. Yet beneath all the beauty, beneath the marble and ceremony, human emotions continued their patient work: affection, jealousy, resentment, longing. These feelings moved silently through palace corridors, touching rulers and servants alike, and sometimes they gave birth to stories that history would remember for centuries. Stories involving powerful men whose names filled monuments. Stories involving women whose influence reached far beyond public view. Stories of admiration, betrayal, and whispered scandals. For before long, the affairs that surrounded Roman emperors themselves would emerge from the shadows, and once those stories began, the quiet world of the palace would never seem quite so peaceful again. As another quiet night settled over the Palatine Hill, and silver moonlight rested upon the rooftops of Rome, the imperial palaces seemed almost peaceful. The fountains continued their endless songs, guards paced slowly beneath flickering torches, and far below, the city itself drifted toward sleep. Yet behind the curtains of those grand residences, lives of extraordinary privilege often became tangled in deeply human emotions. Because emperors, despite the statues raised in their honor, were never simply symbols of power, they were husbands, fathers, lovers, and sometimes people haunted by loneliness hidden beneath layers of ceremony. To the citizens of Rome, emperors appeared larger than life, their images decorated coins, their names echoed through temples and forums, their decisions shaped provinces stretching across continents. But those who lived close to the throne understood something different. They knew that rulers remained vulnerable to affection, to jealousy, and to desires no crown could silence, and when emotions entered the lives of emperors, the consequences often extended far beyond private walls. Stories spread quickly throughout the empire. Some were true. Others became distorted through gossip and exaggeration. Historians themselves often struggled to separate fact from rumor, and perhaps that uncertainty only deepened the fascination, because mystery has always accompanied great power. Many emperors entered marriages arranged for political reasons. Such unions strengthened alliances and secured stability, yet affection could not always be commanded. Sometimes genuine devotion blossomed. Letters and accounts speak of rulers who mourned deeply when loved ones were lost. They built monuments, commissioned statues, and carried memories that remained long after grief had faded into silence. But other relationships unfolded very differently. Distance grew, trust weakened, and loneliness quietly entered lives surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Within the palace, new companions appeared, trusted confidants offered comfort, friendships deepened, and whispers inevitably followed. For in Rome, nothing concerning the emperor remained truly private. Servants observed, courtiers speculated, visitors carried stories beyond the palace gates, and soon, rumors traveled through markets and bathhouses across the city. Sometimes these tales reflected little more than imagination. Roman writers, after all, possessed a remarkable appetite for scandal. A dramatic story attracted attention, and history itself occasionally became colored by personal opinions and political rivalries. Yet hidden beneath exaggeration, real emotions often existed, feelings of admiration, longing, resentment, and the complicated search for companionship. One ruler might seek comfort after personal tragedy, another found himself surrounded by individuals eager to influence him. Some relationships brought happiness, others inspired suspicion, and a few became the subjects of stories repeated for generations. Curiously, ordinary Romans watched these developments with endless fascination. Perhaps because emperors represented something strangely familiar, people recognized that immense authority did not erase loneliness, wealth could not guarantee contentment, and power offered no protection against matters of the heart. In this way, the rulers of Rome seemed almost closer to their subjects than statues suggested, human, fallible, and sometimes deeply misunderstood. Within the palace gardens, beneath the shade of cypress trees and marble colonnades, quiet conversations continued, promises were made, friendships strengthened, and secrets remained carefully guarded. But secrecy itself rarely lasts forever, especially when ambition enters the story. Because emotions surrounding emperors attracted more than affection, they attracted opportunity. Courtiers sought influence, families pursued advantages, and rivals watched carefully for weakness. A personal relationship could suddenly become a matter of public concern. A private choice might shape appointments, alliances, and reputations, and whispers, once confined to palace corridors, could echo throughout the empire. As dawn approached, and the first light touched the temples of Rome, the city awakened unaware of the countless conversations held during the night. Conversations that historians would later transform into legends. Yet among all those stories, none proved more fascinating than those involving the remarkable women who stood near power. women praised by admirers, criticized by enemies, and remembered by history with equal parts fascination and mystery. For behind many Roman scandals, there were figures whose influence reached far beyond what society openly acknowledged, and their stories were only beginning to emerge from the shadows. As the first rays of sunlight spread gently across the city, and the morning mist slowly disappeared above the rooftops of Rome, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Merchants prepared their stalls, fountains sparkled beneath the rising sun, servants hurried through courtyards carrying baskets and water jars, and within the great villas and imperial residences of the city, women whose names history would never fully forget quietly began another day. For all the power displayed by emperors and senators, Roman society often overlooked another force, a quieter force, one that moved through conversations rather than commands, through influence rather than titles, and though their voices were not always recorded fairly. Many women stood astonishingly close to the center of Roman life. Their stories survive only in fragments, pieces preserved by historians, poets, and sometimes enemies who viewed powerful women with deep suspicion, because in ancient Rome, a woman who possessed beauty, intelligence, or influence often inspired admiration, but also unease. Many Roman writers were men, and they did not always describe women kindly. Especially those who appeared too ambitious, too independent, or too capable of shaping events behind the scenes. As a result, history itself became wrapped in shadows. Separating truth from exaggeration is not always easy, yet beneath the dramatic accusations, real human lives emerge, lives filled with hopes and fears remarkably familiar to our own. Within aristocratic households, women managed vast responsibilities. They supervised servants, oversaw estates, raised children, maintained family traditions, and preserved relationships that connected powerful families together. These tasks demanded intelligence and patience, for although Roman customs limited public authority, private influence often flowed through women in ways invisible to outsiders. A well-timed conversation, a trusted friendship, or a carefully arranged marriage could shape futures more effectively than public speeches. And because influence itself remained difficult to measure, rumors often flourished, people whispered, stories spread. And whenever events unfolded unexpectedly, curious minds searched for hidden explanations. Many chose to believe that women standing close to power must somehow be responsible. Perhaps this tendency revealed more about society than about the women themselves. Still, certain figures became legendary. Their names echoed through generations. Some were admired for loyalty and wisdom, others became symbols of scandal. Yet history rarely grants anyone the simplicity of being entirely innocent or entirely guilty. Human beings are far more complicated, and so were these women. Some genuinely loved the families they sought to protect, some desired security in uncertain times. Others pursued influence because they understood how fragile fortune could be. After all, life in Rome offered no guarantees, favor changed quickly, friendships faded, and political winds shifted with remarkable speed. Survival often depended upon adapting. Within palace walls, women created circles of trust, friends gathered in shaded gardens, letters traveled between households. Information passed quietly through networks invisible to most men, and amid these delicate relationships, power operated softly. Not through armies, not through decrees, but through understanding people. Perhaps that was why some male historians found such influence unsettling. They preferred clear hierarchies, obvious authority, yet much of life resists simple explanations. Affection influences decisions, trust creates opportunities, and conversations whispered in private chambers sometimes echo across generations. As afternoon sunlight filtered through silk curtains, Roman women read poetry, listened to musicians, walked through fragrant gardens, and worried about the same things people have always worried about: family, love, loss, security, and the uncertain future. But when tragedy or scandal appeared, society often searched for someone to blame, and powerful women, visible enough to attract attention but excluded from official authority, became convenient targets. Some reputations suffered unfairly, others perhaps deserved criticism, but all were transformed into stories larger than themselves, stories repeated for centuries, stories that continue to fascinate even now. And while names changed, one truth remained constant. In Rome, reputation possessed enormous power. Sometimes greater than wealth, greater than beauty, and perhaps even greater than truth itself, because once whispers escaped into the world, they developed lives of their own, and few people understood that danger better than the families whose futures depended upon public opinion. For in the Empire of Rome, reputation could become both shield and weapon, and losing it could prove far more frightening than losing gold. As evening slowly returned to Rome, and long shadows stretched across the Forum and its surrounding streets, the city once again wrapped itself in familiar routines. Shopkeepers closed wooden shutters, the sound of wheels echoed against ancient stones, families gathered for supper beneath the soft glow of oil lamps, and somewhere beyond the busy markets and temples, another kind of activity quietly continued, not commerce, not politics, but something far less visible: the endless exchange of stories. Because in ancient Rome, reputation was a treasure unlike any other. Gold could be stolen, property could be lost, titles could change, but a person's good name, once damaged, was painfully difficult to restore, and so, throughout Roman society, people guarded their reputations with extraordinary care, especially among the wealthy, especially among those whose families had spent generations building influence. Honor was not simply an individual possession, it belonged to entire households. Children inherited it, marriages depended upon it. Political careers rose and fell because of it, and every member of a family carried the burden of protecting something both invisible and precious. This pressure shaped daily life in countless ways. People chose their words carefully, they dressed with dignity, they hosted respectable gatherings, and they paid close attention to how others perceived them. Appearances mattered deeply, sometimes, perhaps too deeply, because appearances and reality rarely lived in perfect harmony. Behind elegant smiles, there could be disappointment. Behind successful marriages, there might be distance, and behind public virtue, private struggles often remained hidden. Yet secrets have curious habits, they rarely remain still. Some escaped through careless remarks, others emerged through jealousy, and many were born from nothing more than imagination. Rome possessed no newspapers, but news traveled remarkably fast. The bathhouses buzzed with conversation, markets overflowed with gossip, dinner guests repeated stories heard from friends of friends, servants carried observations between households, and whispers moved through the city with astonishing speed. What began as uncertainty often transformed into certainty by the time it reached new ears. A glance became an affair, a friendship became a conspiracy, and an innocent meeting acquired meanings never intended. Perhaps people have always done such things. Human beings are storytellers by nature. We search for explanations, we enjoy mysteries, and we are strangely drawn toward the lives of others. The Romans were no different, yet among the elite, the consequences proved far more serious, for powerful families lived beneath constant scrutiny, rivals watched for weaknesses, political opponents searched for opportunities, and reputation itself became a battlefield fought without swords. Accusations, whether true or false, could destroy years of careful effort. A damaging rumor might delay a marriage, end a friendship, or weaken an important alliance, and because honor mattered so deeply, Even unfounded stories inspired fear. Many Romans responded by cultivating carefully crafted images. They commissioned statues, supported temples, hosted generous feasts, and presented themselves as examples of dignity and virtue, not merely because they wished to impress others, but because image itself had become a form of protection. Yet no image remained completely secure. Time and circumstance possessed ways of revealing hidden cracks, and sometimes, the people most terrified of scandal found themselves surrounded by it, perhaps because the harder one struggles to control appearances, the more exhausting life becomes. Letters surviving from antiquity occasionally reveal this quiet burden. Behind formal language and polished expressions, one senses anxiety, the fear of misunderstanding, the desire to preserve harmony, and the exhausting effort required to maintain perfection in an imperfect world. As darkness deepened over Rome, families closed their doors, musicians played softly in distant villas, and conversations continued beneath painted ceilings and flickering lamps. Some words brought comfort, others planted doubts, and somewhere, without anyone realizing it, private emotions were beginning to collide with public ambition. Because reputation alone was no longer the greatest danger. Love itself, that most human of experiences, was becoming capable of threatening careers, alliances, and futures, and in the world of Rome, few things frightened powerful people more than emotions they could not control. As the city of Rome settled into another calm evening, and the sky deepened into shades of violet and fading gold, life within its grand streets continued with quiet precision. Oil lamps were lit one by one, shadows stretched across marble courtyards, and inside the homes of senators and nobles, the night carried both comfort and unease, for in ancient Rome, political life was never separate from personal life. The two were intertwined so closely that even the smallest private emotion could ripple outward into public consequence. A single connection, a single rumor, a single affection could influence careers built over decades. At first glance, Roman politics appeared structured. Senators debated in the Curia, magistrates carried out duties, public ceremonies reinforced order and tradition, but beneath this formal surface, human relationships shaped much of what truly happened. Friendships mattered, marriages mattered, and personal loyalties often carried more weight than official rules. This is why love, in Roman society, was rarely just love. It became part of a larger system of influence. A quiet force moving beneath speeches and laws. Sometimes, a carefully arranged marriage secured political alliances between powerful families. Such unions were not always cold or emotionless. Some grew into genuine partnerships, others remained distant arrangements maintained for public stability. But even when affection existed, it did not erase the expectations surrounding it, because every relationship carried political meaning. Every connection was observed, and every choice could be interpreted. Within elite households, young Romans often discovered that their futures were already entangled in networks of obligation. A suitable marriage could elevate a career, an unsuitable attachment could end it, and personal desire sometimes collided painfully with family expectation. There were moments when affection crossed boundaries it was not meant to cross. A senator might become emotionally involved with someone from a politically inconvenient household. A noblewoman might form a bond that complicated carefully negotiated alliances, and in such cases, the consequences were rarely private. Servants noticed, friends whispered, rivals waited patiently, and soon, what began as intimacy could transform into political vulnerability. Rome was a society that remembered everything, or at least, it allowed stories to persist long enough to shape perception, and perception, in politics, often mattered more than truth. A rumor could weaken authority, a suggestion could shift alliances, and uncertainty could be enough to destroy trust. Even emperors were not immune. their relationships, whether real or imagined, became subjects of endless fascination. Writers recorded them, poets hinted at them, and historians debated them for generations. Some accounts were sincere, others were exaggerated, but all contributed to a growing sense that private life and public power could never be fully separated. Meanwhile, within aristocratic homes, life continued with its familiar rhythm. Banquets were hosted beneath painted ceilings, letters were exchanged carefully, and conversations were held with practiced restraint. Yet beneath this surface calm, tension often lingered, because people understood the stakes. A friendship observed too closely might be questioned, a dinner invitation could be misinterpreted, and a moment of warmth between individuals might be transformed into something far more complicated in the telling. In such an environment, many Romans learned to be cautious with emotion, not because they lacked feeling, but because feeling itself had consequences. Some chose restraint, others chose secrecy, and a few chose risk. Those who risked often discovered that love carried both beauty and danger. It could bring closeness, but it could also attract attention, and attention in Rome was never neutral. It always meant scrutiny. As night deepened across the city, the glow of torches reflected softly on marble walls. Carriages passed quietly through narrow streets, and inside villas, families continued their private lives beneath layers of tradition and expectation. Some were unaware of the tensions forming around them, others felt them clearly but could do little to avoid them, because once emotion entered the world of politics, it rarely remained contained. It spread, it reshaped relationships, it influenced decisions made far from private rooms, and sometimes it altered the course of entire careers. Yet even as risks grew, people continued to form bonds, to trust, to care, to hope, because despite everything Rome understood about power, it could never remove something deeply human, the need to connect with others, and it is within that need that some of the most fragile stories of the empire quietly begin to unfold. Stories that would soon become impossible to ignore. As night deepened over Rome, and the final glow of sunset disappeared behind distant hills, the city entered its quieter phase. Lanterns flickered along stone streets, shadows gathered between marble columns, and within the grand homes of the elite, life continued behind carefully closed doors. At first glance, everything appeared controlled, measured, composed. Dinner conversations followed familiar etiquette, guests exchanged polite words, servants moved with practiced silence, and music softened the atmosphere like a gentle veil. But beneath this surface of order, another layer of life existed, one that rarely reached public view. In ancient Rome, not all relationships were meant to be seen. Some were hidden out of necessity, others out of desire, and many existed in the delicate space between duty and emotion. For the Roman elite, visibility carried risk. To be seen too often with the wrong person, or to be linked through rumor, could reshape reputations overnight. And so, many connections were carefully concealed. Meetings were arranged in private gardens, messages were delivered through trusted servants, and conversations took place in rooms where doors remained firmly shut. Yet secrecy, no matter how carefully maintained, was never perfect. Rome was a city that observed everything. Servants noticed patterns, neighbors remembered details, and even the smallest inconsistency could become the seed of speculation. Within aristocratic circles, hidden relationships took many forms. Some were born from affection that could not be publicly acknowledged, others from political incompatibility, and some from simple human longing. The need for understanding in a world that often demanded restraint. These relationships were not always scandalous, sometimes they were tender, carefully protected, shared between individuals who understood the importance of silence. But secrecy itself created pressure. The more carefully something was hidden, the more fragile it became. a delayed return home, a whispered conversation overheard by accident, a gift noticed by the wrong observer. Small details could slowly accumulate into suspicion, and suspicion in Rome rarely remained quiet for long, because society itself was built upon awareness. People paid attention, not always with malice, but with curiosity. And curiosity often transformed into interpretation, interpretation into rumor, and rumor into narrative. Once a narrative formed, it became difficult to undo, even without proof, even without certainty. Within elite households, the emotional weight of secrecy often shaped behavior. People became cautious with gestures, measured with words, careful with expressions that might be misunderstood, and yet, human emotion continued to find its way through these barriers. A glance held too long, a conversation repeated in memory, a moment of kindness taken more seriously than intended. These small things carried significance in a society constantly searching for meaning beneath appearances. At times, entire networks of relationships existed almost invisibly, known only to a few individuals, protected by trust, sustained through discretion. But even these fragile systems were vulnerable to change. A single betrayal, a single mistake, could unravel carefully built boundaries. And when that happened, the consequences rarely remained private, because in Rome, information did not stay still, it traveled, it evolved, it grew, and once it reached the wider world, it no longer belonged to those who created it. Meanwhile, public life continued its formal rhythm. Senators debated policies, officials managed provinces, and public ceremonies reinforced the illusion of stability. Yet beneath this structured world, private connections quietly influenced decisions, friendships affected appointments, affection shaped loyalties, and hidden bonds occasionally altered the direction of political choices. This blending of private and public life created a constant tension. A sense that nothing was ever fully separate, that behind every public action, there might exist a private reason, and this awareness made Roman society both deeply interconnected and endlessly suspicious. As the night grew colder, and the city settled into silence, lamps burned in upper floor chambers, letters were written and sealed, and conversations continued in low voices behind closed doors. Some relationships remained hidden successfully for years, others surfaced unexpectedly, and a few became stories that outlived the people involved, because secrecy, in a society as observant as Rome, was never permanent. It could delay discovery, but not always prevent it. And as long as human desire existed, so too would the fragile tension between what is seen and what is carefully concealed, a tension that would soon define some of the most famous stories in Roman history. As the early morning light returned to Rome, soft and pale over marble rooftops and quiet courtyards, the city once again revealed its layered rhythms. Markets slowly awakened, servants moved through shaded walkways, water shimmered in fountains carved from stone, and within the grand homes of the elite, a different kind of structure quietly shaped every moment of daily life. In ancient Rome, nothing existed outside the reach of wealth and status. They were not simply measures of comfort, they were forces, invisible currents that influenced nearly every interaction. Who was invited, who was ignored, who was trusted, and who was remembered. Even the smallest social gathering carried meaning. A dinner invitation was never just hospitality, it was recognition. A seat at the table reflected position, proximity to the host reflected favor, and absence could speak louder than words. Within aristocratic circles, wealth created possibilities, but status determined direction. Families with ancient names carried weight that gold alone could not match, and newer families, no matter how rich, often found themselves carefully navigating established hierarchies. Influence in this world moved quietly. It was built through relationships, strengthened through marriages, and reinforced through generosity that was never entirely free of expectation. A gift could create obligation. A favor could establish loyalty, and a shared meal could become the beginning of long-term alignment, because in Rome, almost every action had social consequence, even affection, especially affection, for love between individuals rarely existed in isolation. It moved through families. It touched reputations, and it often intersected with financial and political interests in ways that were difficult to separate. A wealthy household did not simply live comfortably, it existed within a network of dependence and influence. Clients depended on patrons, freedmen relied on former masters, alliances were carefully maintained through repeated interaction, and within this system, personal relationships became part of a larger structure of power. A friendship might support a career, a marriage might secure property, a connection might open doors that would otherwise remain closed. Yet this same system created pressure, because every relationship carried expectations. Every gesture might be interpreted, and every silence could be questioned. In such an environment, people learn to read meaning into everything. A change in tone, a delayed response, a missing invitation, even subtle differences in behavior could be analyzed endlessly, and this constant interpretation shaped how Romans lived with one another. Wealth also affected visibility. The more prominent a family became, the more closely they were observed. Their actions became public. Interest, their relationships became subjects of speculation, and their private lives, no matter how carefully protected, were never entirely free from attention. Yet despite this scrutiny, many aristocrats continued to seek genuine connection, friendship, affection, trust. These human needs did not disappear beneath layers of status. If anything, they became more complicated, because sincerity had to navigate expectation, and emotion had to exist alongside strategy. Within villas filled with marble and gold, conversations often carried dual meaning: what was said aloud and what was implied. Guests smiled politely while assessing each other silently. Hosts extended generosity while carefully observing reactions, and beneath the surface of elegance, a constant awareness shaped every interaction. But Rome was not only a place of calculation, it was also a place of desire. People still laughed, still formed attachments, still found comfort in companionship despite uncertainty, and sometimes, relationships grew simply because two individuals understood each other in ways that others did not. These moments of connection stood apart from the systems of wealth and rank, even if they could never fully escape them. As the sun moved higher above the city, shadows shifted across courtyards, carriages passed through busy streets, and the sounds of daily life filled the air once more. Yet beneath this ordinary movement, the invisible structures of status continued to shape everything, quietly, constantly, unseen but always present, because in ancient Rome, wealth and influence were never just background elements, they were part of the atmosphere itself, and every story, no matter how personal, was touched by them in some way. As the afternoon heat settled over Rome, and golden light softened across marble streets and tiled rooftops, the city seemed to pause in a quiet haze of movement and sound. Fountains trickled steadily in shaded courtyards, merchants spoke in low, tired voices, and beneath the rhythm of daily life, something far less visible continued to move. Stories, not written, not officially recorded, but spoken, retold, and reshaped with every telling. In ancient Rome, a rumor was never a simple piece of information. It was a living thing, one that changed as it traveled. A single comment in a courtyard could become a tale by evening, and by the following week, it might resemble something entirely different. People rarely realized they were spreading rumors. Often, they believed they were sharing insight, or concern, or harmless curiosity. But language in Rome carried momentum, and once a story began to move, it rarely stopped in its original form. Within aristocratic homes, servants exchanged observations while performing daily tasks. Guests mentioned small details from dinner gatherings. Visitors carried impressions from one household to another, and slowly, these fragments merged, creating narratives that felt increasingly complete, even when they were not. The fascinating part was not just how rumors spread, but how quickly they became believable, because in Rome, status gave weight to words. If someone important spoke, others listened. If a respected household repeated a claim, it gained credibility, and if enough people accepted a story, it began to feel like truth. Even without evidence, even without confirmation, rumors did not remain confined to the elite. They traveled further, into markets, into bathhouses, into the voices of ordinary citizens who found them both entertaining and revealing. Bathhouses in particular became centers of conversation, steam-filled rooms where strangers exchanged news as casually as greetings, politics, scandals, affairs. All blended into a continuous flow of speculation, and from there, stories expanded. Outward again, servants carried them into homes, travelers brought them to other cities, and in time, some reached distant provinces of the empire. By the time a rumor traveled that far, its origin had often become unrecognizable. This process gave Roman society a strange quality. Distance did not reduce curiosity, it increased imagination. When details were missing, people filled the gaps themselves, and what they imagined often felt more compelling than reality. Within this environment, even private moments could become public narratives. A conversation overheard at a banquet, a letter seen by the wrong eyes, a friendship misinterpreted, each could become the seed of something much larger, and once a story formed, it took on a life of its own. Families often attempted to control rumors, they issued statements, they corrected misunderstandings. They reinforced their public image through ceremonies and displays of virtue. But controlling perception was difficult, because rumors did not follow official channels. They moved through emotion, through curiosity, through repetition, and sometimes, through envy. Not all rumors were malicious, some were simply misunderstandings, others were born from admiration or fascination, but even harmless stories could create consequences. A marriage proposal might be reconsidered, a friendship might weaken, a reputation might shift subtly in the eyes of society. And in Rome, subtle shifts could matter greatly, because reputation was cumulative, built over years, but vulnerable in moments. As evening approached, and shadows lengthened across the forum, the city began to quiet again, yet conversations did not stop. They simply moved indoors, into villas, into courtyards, into private rooms where oil lamps burned softly, and their stories continued to evolve. Because Rome never truly stopped talking, even in silence, it listened, and what it heard, it remembered in its own way. Over time, some rumors faded completely, others became legends, and a few, the most persistent ones, survived long after the people involved had disappeared into history. But before these stories could fully transform into legend, they first had to pass through countless mouths, shaped by emotion, carried by curiosity, and carried across an empire that never stopped watching itself. And it was within this endless exchange of whispers that Rome's most famous scandals quietly began to take form. As night returned once again to Rome, and the city streets softened beneath the glow of oil lamps, a different rhythm began to unfold behind closed doors. From the outside, the villas of the wealthy appeared calm, curtains drawn, courtyards still, gardens resting beneath moonlight. But inside those homes, another world slowly awakened. Private gatherings in ancient Rome were rarely simple celebrations. They were carefully arranged moments where social life, reputation, and subtle influence came together. Music would begin quietly in the background, Soft melodies played on stringed instruments, servants moved between guests with trays of wine and light food, and conversation. Carefully shaped conversation filled the space between notes of music and flickering light. At first glance, these gatherings seemed relaxed, even peaceful, friends meeting friends, families sharing evenings, guests exchanging polite words beneath painted ceilings and marble columns. But beneath that surface calm, each gathering carried meaning. Who was invited mattered, who was absent mattered even more, and the arrangement of seating, often unnoticed by outsiders, reflected layers of social awareness. In Rome, even leisure was structured by expectation, yet despite this structure, private parties offered something rare, a space where the rigid order of public life softened slightly, where people could speak more freely, where laughter felt less restrained, and where emotions, normally hidden behind formal behavior, could briefly surface. Within these rooms, alliances were quietly strengthened, friendships were tested, and new connections sometimes formed without announcement or ceremony. A shared story, a moment of humor, a thoughtful conversation in a quiet corner. Small things that carried quiet weight in a society that paid close attention to relationships. But not all interactions were harmless. Private gatherings also created opportunities for misunderstanding, a gesture interpreted incorrectly, a conversation overheard halfway, a friendship observed too closely. And in Rome, interpretation often mattered more than intention. Servants played a silent but important role in these environments. They arranged spaces, served guests, and noticed far more than they were expected to mention. A glance exchanged between two individuals, a letter briefly revealed, a private conversation held near an open doorway. These small details rarely stayed private for long, because in a household filled with people, secrets struggled to remain contained. Even so, Roman elites continued to host such gatherings regularly, not only for enjoyment, but because social presence itself carried importance. To be seen mattered, to be included mattered, and to remain connected ensured continued relevance in a society where status shifted gradually but constantly. Food and drink flowed through these evenings with careful generosity, dishes prepared with attention, wine served in measured amounts, music adjusting the atmosphere without overwhelming conversation, and beneath it all, the subtle performance of refinement continued. Guests observed one another while appearing relaxed, they listened carefully while seeming casual, and they spoke with layers of meaning that often extended beyond their words. Yet among all this complexity, moments of sincerity still appeared. A genuine laugh shared between old friends, a quiet exchange of comfort during difficult times, a conversation that felt briefly free of calculation. These moments stood out precisely because they were rare. As the night deepened, some guests departed early, others remained as conversations softened into quieter tones, candles burned lower, shadows stretched longer across mosaic floors, and the energy of the gathering shifted from public performance to private reflection. Eventually, only a few remained, speaking in hushed voices, sharing thoughts that might never leave the room. And in those final hours, when the world outside felt distant, private parties revealed something deeper about Roman society. They were not only spaces of celebration, they were spaces where human connection was negotiated carefully, and where the boundaries between public identity and private emotion became gently blurred. And as the last lamps were extinguished, and silence returned to the villa, the night carried away words that might later resurface in unexpected ways, because even in moments of intimacy, Rome was always listening. As the night deepened over Rome once more, and the final sounds of distant conversations faded into the silence of stone streets, the city entered a quieter, more reflective state. Oil lamps burned low in upper windows, shadows gathered beneath arches and colonnades, and somewhere within the vast memory of the empire, stories lingered that were never fully preserved. Not all events in ancient Rome were recorded clearly, some were written in fragments. Others survived only through rumor, and many were shaped so heavily by interpretation that truth and imagination became nearly impossible to separate. These were the scandals that time never fully explained, the ones mentioned briefly by historians, hinted at in letters, or whispered about in poetry that survived long after its authors were gone. In Rome, history was not always a complete record. It was a collection of voices, each with its own intention, each shaped by its own perspective, and so, some stories arrived to the present incomplete, like broken mosaics, beautiful, intriguing, but missing essential pieces. Among the aristocracy, many private events were never meant for public memory. A meeting that caused tension between families, a relationship that disrupted carefully arranged alliances, a sudden shift in loyalty that altered political expectations. These moments were often too sensitive to document directly. And yet, they left traces. Hints scattered through surviving texts, comments made by cautious writers, and silences that sometimes spoke louder than words, because what is not said can be as revealing as what is. Some scandals were intentionally obscured, families sought to protect reputations, names were softened or omitted, events were described in vague terms to avoid direct implication, and over time, clarity dissolved. Other stories faded simply because they were not considered important enough to preserve fully, yet what survives often gains power precisely because it is incomplete. The imagination fills the gaps, and centuries later, readers continue to wonder what truly happened. Within these lost narratives, we glimpse a different Rome, not the one of statues and grand monuments, but one filled with uncertainty, a place where rumors influenced decisions, where private emotion shaped public consequences, and where even powerful families could find themselves vulnerable to sudden shifts in perception. Some scandals likely began quietly, a private conversation that should not have been overheard, a letter that reached unintended eyes, a friendship that developed in unexpected circumstances. Small moments that gradually expanded beyond control. In a society as interconnected as Rome, nothing remained isolated for long. Even the most private actions could eventually intersect with public life. And once that happened, control became difficult to regain. Historians of later generations often struggled with these stories. Some treated them as moral lessons, others as entertainment, and some simply as mysteries that could never be fully resolved. But beneath all interpretations, there remains a sense of human reality, people living their lives, making decisions, forming relationships, and navigating the complex pressures of a society that observed them constantly. Time has erased many details, yet it has preserved enough to suggest patterns of ambition, of affection, of rivalry, and of choices made in moments that seemed private at the time, but later became part of something larger. As Rome expanded and evolved, its memory became layered, new generations added their own interpretations. Older accounts were copied, altered, or lost, and what remained was a blend of fact and narrative. History and storytelling intertwined so closely that separating them is often impossible. Perhaps that is what makes these forgotten scandals so compelling, not certainty, but possibility, not clarity, but suggestion. As the final lamps of the night dimmed across the city, and silence settled once again over ancient streets, these half-remembered stories remained suspended in time, waiting for interpretation, for imagination, and for the next generation to wonder what truly lay behind the names and fragments that survived, because in Rome, even what is lost continues to speak. As the city of Rome rested beneath a calm night sky, and distant echoes of daily life faded into stillness, a softer atmosphere seemed to settle over its ancient walls. Oil lamps flickered gently in villa windows, courtyards cooled beneath moonlight, and inside private chambers, thoughts turned inward, toward matters not of politics or reputation, but of emotion. In ancient Rome, love was never understood in a simple way. It was not separate from duty, not isolated from family, and rarely free from expectation. Instead, it existed within a network of obligations, a delicate balance between personal feeling and social responsibility. Romans often spoke of loyalty as a virtue. Something steady, something reliable, something that held families and friendships together through time. Loyalty to one's household, to one's name, to one's alliances. These were considered essential foundations of Roman life, and yet, love did not always align neatly with loyalty. Sometimes it supported it, strengthened it, gave it emotional depth, but at other times, it pulled in different directions entirely. Poets in Rome explored these tensions with quiet sensitivity. They wrote about affection that felt both joyful and painful, about desire that conflicted with expectation, and about the fragile nature of trust in relationships shaped by social structure. Their words suggest something timeless, that human emotion rarely follows rules. Within aristocratic families, love was often shaped by circumstance. Marriages arranged for stability might slowly grow into companionship, or remain distant but respectful partnerships. Affection could develop gradually, through shared responsibilities, shared memories, shared struggles, but love could also appear unexpectedly, in moments that defied planning or logic. A conversation, a glance, the presence that felt unusually meaningful. Roman society did not always reject such feelings, but it treated them carefully, because emotion carried consequences. A bond between individuals could influence family expectations, it could complicate alliances, or create tensions that extended beyond personal life, and so, many Romans learned to navigate love with caution, not suppressing it entirely, but balancing it against obligation. Loyalty, meanwhile, remained a stabilizing force. It was expected in friendships, in marriages, in political relationships, but loyalty itself was tested frequently, by ambition, by fear, by changing circumstances, and by the unpredictable nature of human emotion. Within households, people often struggled to maintain harmony between what they felt and what they were expected to feel. A son might respect his father deeply, while still wishing for a different path in life. A wife might care for her household, while quietly experiencing emotions she could not openly express. A friend might remain loyal, yet feel the strain of competing interests. These tensions were not always dramatic. Often, they existed in silence, in unspoken thoughts, in carefully controlled behavior, in small compromises made over time. Even public displays of loyalty sometimes carried layers of meaning. A gesture of support might also signal political alignment. A marriage might represent both affection and strategy, and a friendship might exist simultaneously as personal connection and social necessity. This blending of emotion and structure created a uniquely Roman emotional landscape, one where feelings were never entirely private, but never fully public either. They existed in between, in subtle expressions, in carefully chosen words, in actions that carried meaning beyond their surface. As night deepened, and the city grew quieter, individual lives continued in this delicate balance. Some people found comfort in loyalty that endured, others found meaning in love that resisted expectation, and many lived somewhere between the two, navigating both as best they could, because in Rome, to live was to constantly negotiate between heart and duty, between desire and responsibility, between what one felt and what one was expected to be, and in that negotiation, the true emotional world of Rome quietly revealed itself. Not through grand declarations, but through countless small choices made every day. As dawn returned once more to Rome, and soft light slowly spread across marble rooftops and quiet courtyards, the city appeared, as always, composed and orderly. Statues stood unmoving in the growing brightness, fountains resumed their steady rhythm, and households began to stir behind carefully maintained walls. From the outside, Roman society often looked perfectly structured. Families presented themselves with dignity. Homes reflected refinement, and public behavior followed long-established expectations. But beneath this polished surface, another reality existed, one far more complex and far more human. In ancient Rome, public image was not simply a reflection of life. It was a construction, carefully shaped, maintained over time, and adjusted whenever necessary. A family's reputation depended on how they were seen, not only by friends and allies, but by rivals and strangers who constantly observed them. This meant that appearances carried immense importance. The way one spoke, the way one dressed, the way one hosted guests, even the way one walked through public spaces could influence perception. But private life told a different story. Inside homes, far away from the gaze of society, people behaved differently. They spoke more freely, they expressed emotions more openly, and they experienced moments that would never appear in official accounts or public memory. This separation between public and private life was not always deliberate. Often, it developed naturally, a response to social expectation, a way to maintain stability in a world that valued reputation so highly. Yet over time, the difference between the two worlds became more pronounced. Public life demanded control, private life allowed vulnerability. Public life rewarded restraint, private life revealed emotion, and living between these two spaces required constant adjustment. Many Romans became skilled at managing this balance. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to display confidence and when to conceal uncertainty, when to present harmony, even if internal tensions existed. Within elite households, this duality was especially visible. A banquet might showcase unity and refinement, while private disagreements continued behind closed doors. A marriage might appear stable in public, while emotional distance existed in private. A friendship might seem loyal, while subtle competition remained unspoken. These contrasts were not always signs of deception. Often, they were simply part of social survival. Because reputation had practical consequences, it influenced political opportunity, marriage prospects, business relationships, and long-term stability. As a result, many Romans felt pressure to maintain an image that reflected not only who they were, but who they were expected to be. Yet private life remained persistent, unfiltered, unobserved by most, and within it, people found space for honesty, for reflection, for emotions that could not easily be expressed elsewhere. Children grew up learning both worlds simultaneously. How to behave in public settings, and how to exist within the private rhythms of family life. Over time, this created individuals who were highly aware of social perception, yet still deeply shaped by personal experience. Even emotions themselves could differ between these two spaces. In public, feelings were often restrained, carefully measured. In private, they became more open, more immediate, more real, and this contrast shaped much of Roman storytelling. Writers often focused on what was seen, but hinted at what was hidden. Historians recorded public events, while speculating about private motivations, and poets explored the emotional gap between appearance and truth. As evening approached, and shadows stretched across the city once again, Roman life settled into its familiar rhythm. But behind every closed door, a different story continued, one that rarely aligned perfectly with what the outside world believed, because in Rome, what was visible was only part of the truth, and sometimes, not the most important part. As night slowly settled over Rome, and the final traces of daylight faded behind the horizon, the city began to quiet once again. Torches flickered along stone streets, windows glowed softly from within grand villas, and behind closed doors, life continued in carefully maintained privacy. But in ancient Rome, nothing remained without consequence for long. Every relationship, every rumor, every private decision had the potential to reach far beyond the walls where it began. Affairs, whether real or only suspected, rarely stayed contained within personal life. They moved outward, slowly at first, through whispers, through observation, through interpretation. And then, suddenly, they became public knowledge. When this happened, the consequences could be subtle or severe. Sometimes a reputation shifted slightly, a family became less favored, an invitation no longer arrived, a marriage proposal was quietly withdrawn. Other times, the impact was far greater. Political alliances weakened, careers stalled, and households that once held influence found themselves navigating new uncertainty. In Rome, reputation and reality were closely connected, but reputation often acted first, before facts could be confirmed, before truth could be established, and so, perception itself became a powerful force within aristocratic society. An affair did not need to be proven to cause damage. The suggestion alone could be enough, because people in Rome were deeply attentive to social meaning. They read between lines, they interpreted silence, and they noticed even the smallest irregularities in behavior, a change in routine, a delayed return, a repeated name in conversation. Each detail could be collected and assembled into a narrative, whether accurate or not. Families often attempted to respond quickly when rumors emerged. They reinforced their public image. They arranged gatherings to demonstrate unity, they increased visibility in public ceremonies, and they emphasized loyalty through carefully staged appearances. But control was never complete, because stories moved independently of intention. Once spoken, they continued to travel. Servants discussed them privately, guests repeated them at dinners, strangers exchanged them in public spaces, and slowly, they became part of collective memory. Even emperors and senators were not immune. Their personal lives were examined closely, their relationships interpreted politically, and their private choices often became symbols of broader narratives about power and morality. In such an environment, emotional decisions carried significant weight. Affection could strengthen bonds, but it could also complicate them. A single relationship might unite two powerful families, or place them in quiet opposition, and when emotions overlapped with ambition, the consequences became even more unpredictable. Some individuals adapted by becoming more guarded, carefully limiting what others could see, controlling their movements, and choosing words with extreme caution. Others accepted the risk, allowing relationships to form despite uncertainty, knowing that any connection could eventually become public. Yet even caution offered no complete protection. Because in Rome, observation was constant, and interpretation was unavoidable. Over time, this created a society where privacy itself became fragile, not because it did not exist, but because it was always at risk of becoming visible, and once visible, it changed shape. What had been personal became social, what had been intimate became political, and what had been uncertain became defined by public opinion. As the night deepened further, and households grew quiet, the city continued its invisible exchange of information. Stories passed gently from one place to another, some fading quickly, others persisting longer than expected, and a few becoming part of history itself, because in ancient Rome, consequences were not always immediate, but they were rarely absent, and every action, no matter how private, had the potential to echo far beyond its origin. As the city of Rome rests beneath a quiet, distant night, and the last movements of daily life fade into silence, there is a sense that something larger remains behind everything we have witnessed. Not a single story, not a single scandal, but a pattern, a reflection of how an entire civilization understood itself. By now, we have moved through villas filled with secrets, palaces filled with whispered conversations, and streets where rumors traveled faster than official truth, and slowly, a deeper image of ancient Rome begins to form, not the Rome of statues and triumphal arches alone, but a Rome built upon people, their choices, their emotions, and the constant negotiation between what they felt and what they were expected to show. These stories of affairs, rumors, and hidden relationships are often remembered as scandals, but they also reveal something more subtle, something more human. They show a society where personal life and public identity were never truly separate, where a private emotion could ripple outward and reshape how entire families were seen, and where reputation itself became a form of power. In Rome, status was not only inherited, it was maintained, protected, and constantly evaluated by others. This created a culture of awareness. People learned to observe carefully, to interpret behavior, to understand meaning beneath appearance, and to protect themselves through controlled presentation. But beneath this structure, ordinary human needs remained unchanged: the need for affection, for connection, for recognition, and for belonging. These needs did not disappear under the weight of social expectation. Instead, they adapted to it, finding expression in quieter ways, in careful relationships, in hidden conversations, in moments that left only faint traces in historical records. Even the most powerful individuals in Rome, those whose names shaped laws and empires, lived within this emotional landscape. They were not separate from it, they were part of it. And their private lives, though often obscured by history, still influenced the world around them. What becomes clear through these stories is that Rome was not a society of simple oppositions. Public versus private, power versus emotion, duty versus desire. Instead, it was a constant blending of all these forces, a civilization where boundaries were fluid, and where meaning often depended on perspective. Historians who wrote about Rome were themselves participants in this complexity. Some emphasized morality, others focused on politics, and many shaped narratives through personal bias or limited information. As a result, what survives is not a complete picture, but a layered one, filled with interpretations, gaps, and possibilities. Yet even in its incompleteness, it reveals something consistent: that human relationships were central to how Rome functioned. Not just in families, but in politics, in alliances, in daily life, and in the subtle exchanges that held society together. Affection could influence decisions, loyalty could shift outcomes, and reputation could determine futures. These were not separate forces, they were interconnected, and through them, Rome maintained its structure. As the night grows deeper, and silence returns once again to the ancient streets, we are left with a quiet realization that beneath all grandeur, all power, and all ceremony, ancient Rome was ultimately shaped by human emotion, complex, unpredictable, and deeply familiar. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to linger, because they do not feel distant, they feel recognizable, as if the past is not fully past at all, but still quietly echoing beneath the surface of time. As the night finally settles over Rome, not the Rome of noise and movement, but the Rome of memory, everything begins to slow, the streets grow still, the lamps burn lower, and even the echoes of conversation seem to dissolve into the air itself. It feels as if the city is breathing more softly now, releasing the weight of everything it has carried through these stories, the affairs, the rumors, the hidden moments that once felt so alive, now drift further away, becoming part of something larger than themselves, history, but not the kind of history written in sharp lines or fixed answers, this is a quieter history, one made of impressions, of fragments, of human experiences that never fully survived in complete form. As we look back on ancient Rome, what remains is not a single truth, but layers of understanding, a society shaped by appearance and reality, by loyalty and desire, by reputation and secrecy, all existing at the same time, and within those layers, we find people, not symbols, not distant figures carved in marble, but individuals who lived with uncertainty, who made decisions without knowing how they would be remembered, who loved, who feared, who hoped, and who tried, in their own way, to navigate a world where every action carried meaning. The stories we have walked through are not only about scandal or power. They are about connection, about the invisible threads that tied people together, even when those ties were complicated or fragile. In every whispered rumor, there was curiosity. In every hidden relationship, there was emotion. In every consequence, there was a reminder that nothing in Rome existed in isolation. Everything touched something else, and as time moved forward, the empire itself became memory, its voices fading, its streets quieting, its private moments dissolving into fragments preserved only in scattered accounts and imagination. Yet something remains, not certainty, but atmosphere, a sense of a world that once existed fully, with all its beauty and contradiction intact, and perhaps that is what draws us back to it again and again, not because we can fully understand it, but because we can recognize something familiar within it, the same emotional patterns, the same quiet struggles between what is seen and what is felt, the same search for meaning within relationships and within society itself. Now, as this journey gently closes, imagine the city one last time, the marble glowing faintly under moonlight, the distant sound of water in an empty fountain, the soft movement of wind through silent courtyards, and then nothing, only stillness, only time, and the feeling that history is not truly separate from us, but resting quietly beneath everything we are, waiting to be remembered again. Slowly, we step back from ancient Rome, not leaving it behind, but allowing it to fade gently into the distance, like a story told at night, that softens the mind and slowly brings rest. And as silence returns completely, there is nothing more to uncover, only the quiet world of history, drifting endlessly, just beyond the edge of sleep.